This wasn't an act of mercy. This was a calculated move. In the last 48 hours, Venezuela made an announcement that immediately caught the attention of governments, human rights organizations, and geopolitical analysts around the world. Political prisoners, some held for years without trial, are being released. Opposition figures, journalists, activists, and foreign nationals are walking free from detention centers across the country. On the surface, it looks like progress, a humanitarian gesture, a sign that diplomacy might be working. But here's what most news outlets won't tell you. This release isn't happening because Venezuela suddenly developed a conscience. It's happening because the pressure became unbearable, and because Caracas just made a strategic chess move that could reshape the entire standoff with Washington. So, let's break this down with absolute clarity. What actually happened? Who these prisoners are? Why Venezuela is doing this right now? And most importantly, what this tells us about where this crisis is headed next. Because if you think this story ends with released prisoners walking into their families' arms, you're missing the bigger game being played. What actually happened? Here are the facts, stripped of spin from either side. Venezuelan government officials confirmed that an important number of detainees are being released from custody immediately. The announcement came from senior officials who carefully framed the decision as a gesture toward peace, dialogue, and national reconciliation. Among those being freed, political activists who've spent years behind bars for opposing the government, journalists who were arrested for reporting stories the regime didn't want told, opposition figures who dared to challenge Venezuela's leadership, and critically, several foreign nationals, including European citizens who were detained on accusations of espionage and subversion. Sounds promising, right? Here's the problem. Venezuelan authorities didn't release a full list of names. They didn't confirm how many people remain imprisoned. They didn't provide transparency about judicial processes or guarantees that these releases are permanent. And that lack of detail? It's not an oversight. It's deliberate. Because in geopolitics, what you don't say is often more revealing than what you do. Who these prisoners really are. To understand why this moment matters, you need to know who's been locked up and why. For years, Venezuela has been accused by international human rights organizations of weaponizing detention as a political tool. Arrest someone who criticizes the government, and you send a message to everyone else. Stay silent or face consequences. Those detained have included opposition politicians who challenged election results, student activists who organized protests against economic collapse, labor organizers who fought for workers' rights in a country where inflation destroyed wages overnight, independent journalists who documented corruption, violence, and human rights abuses, and foreign nationals accused of working with intelligence agencies to destabilize the government. Now, the Venezuelan government disputes these characterizations entirely. From their perspective, these weren't political prisoners. They were criminals arrested for violating Venezuelan law, conspiracy, sedition, treason, espionage. This fundamental disagreement, who's a prisoner of conscience versus who's a legitimate criminal, sits at the heart of Venezuela's decades-long conflict with Western governments. And it's why this release is so strategically significant right now. Why this is happening at this exact moment. Timing in geopolitics is never accidental. It's always intentional. So why announce prisoner releases now? Because Venezuela is under crushing, intensifying pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. U.S. sanctions remain locked in place, choking off access to international financial systems. Foreign assets are frozen, cutting the government off from billions in resources. Oil exports, the lifeblood of Venezuela's economy, are tightly controlled and severely restricted. At the same time, International attention on Venezuela has surged dramatically following recent developments involving leadership stability and escalating pressure from the United States and its allies. In other words, Caracas is backed into a corner. And when you're backed into a corner, you don't surrender. You maneuver. Releasing political prisoners serves multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. It eases diplomatic isolation by giving Western governments something they've demanded for years. It signals openness to negotiation without actually committing to anything substantive. And critically, it reshapes global perception, allowing Venezuela to control the narrative and appear reasonable while maintaining ultimate leverage. Make no mistake, this move may look like mercy, but it's actually about power. How Washington and its allies are responding. So far, reactions from the United States and allied governments have been cautiously optimistic but deeply skeptical. Officials publicly welcomed the releases. They acknowledged the humanitarian importance of freeing unjustly detained individuals. But they also emphasized one critical point: far more remains to be done. Human rights organizations are echoing that sentiment, and for good reason. They're pointing out that many detainees are still imprisoned. Judicial transparency remains virtually non-existent, and most worryingly, past releases have sometimes been reversed, with freed prisoners rearrested weeks or months later once international attention faded. In other words, the international community isn't celebrating yet. They're watching, waiting, testing whether Venezuela is genuinely willing to move beyond symbolic gestures or whether this is just another tactical delay designed to relieve pressure without delivering real change. This is being treated not as a breakthrough, but as a test, and Venezuela knows it. What Venezuela gains from this strategic move? From Caracas's perspective, the benefits of releasing prisoners are immediately clear and strategically valuable. First, it lowers immediate international pressure. When governments and human rights groups are screaming about detained journalists, releasing a few creates breathing room and shifts the conversation. Second, it creates diplomatic talking points. Venezuela can now point to concrete action and demand reciprocal gestures like sanctions relief or unfreezing assets. Third, it potentially opens doors for negotiation. If the U.S. wants more releases, it might be willing to trade economic concessions. That leverage is exactly what Venezuela needs right now. And finally, it allows Venezuelan officials to reframe the entire narrative from a regime under siege to a government seeking dialogue and reconciliation. Strategically brilliant, diplomatically effective. But this approach carries significant risk. If releases stop once pressure eases, or if conditions for remaining prisoners worsen, international trust could collapse entirely. Venezuela would be exposed as manipulative rather than cooperative, making future negotiations nearly impossible. So this gamble only works if they can sustain the perception of progress without actually surrendering real power. 4 possible paths. Forward, looking ahead, analysts are identifying several realistic scenarios for how this plays out. Scenario 1. Incremental negotiation. Small confidence-building steps. More prisoner releases, limited judicial reforms, get exchanged for targeted sanctions relief. Neither side gets everything they want, but tensions gradually decrease. This requires sustained commitment from both sides. Scenario 2. Strategic stalling. Venezuela releases just enough prisoners to ease immediate pressure, then slows or stops once international attention shifts elsewhere. This maintains the status quo while appearing cooperative, likely if Venezuela feels it can outlast U.S. political will. Scenario 3. Renewed confrontation. Talks collapse. Political instability grows. Pressure intensifies, and both sides dig in harder than before. This happens if either side miscalculates or if domestic politics in either country demand escalation. Scenario 4. Deeper internal change. Economic realities, not foreign pressure, force fundamental reforms. The Venezuelan government recognizes that continued isolation is unsustainable and begins genuine restructuring. This is the least predictable but potentially most transformative outcome. At this stage, no single path is guaranteed, but watching which direction Venezuela moves next will tell us everything about their true intentions. Why the world should care about this moment. This isn't just a Venezuelan story. The ripple effects touch multiple global systems simultaneously. Regional stability in Latin America gets directly affected. How Venezuela handles political dissent sets precedents for neighboring countries facing similar pressures. Global human rights norms are being tested. If releasing prisoners only happens under extreme pressure, it signals that international advocacy works, but also that leverage matters more than principles. Energy markets remain vulnerable. Any shift in Venezuela's international relationships affects oil supply, pricing, and strategic partnerships with countries like Russia and China. Diplomatic credibility is on the line. If Western pressure produces results, it validates that approach. If it fails, it weakens future leverage. And here's the broader truth this moment reveals. Pressure doesn't always produce immediate results, but it absolutely reshapes behavior over time. The question is whether that behavioral change is real or performative. Here's what you need to understand. The release of political prisoners is significant, but it is absolutely not the end of this story. What matters now is consistency, transparency, and follow-through. Will more prisoners be released? Will judicial processes become more transparent? Will these freed individuals remain free? Or will they quietly disappear back into detention once cameras look away? That's what the international community will be watching with laser focus. And that's exactly what we'll continue tracking and explaining calmly, clearly, and without the noise right here. What's happening? Why it matters? What comes next? Because in a world where headlines scream but rarely explain, understanding the strategy behind the spectacle is how you stay truly informed. And right now, understanding Venezuela's next move might just tell us where this entire hemisphere is headed.